Tenemos el placer
Recording in progress.
de inaugurar este congreso con la participación del profesor Eric Van Jong. El comité organizador le formulamos esta invitación ya hace algunos meses y amablemente respondió que era para él un gusto participar en este homenaje a además tres grandes amigos, tres grandes colegas, como fueron Jaime, Elinda y Chris, coetáneos y contemporáneos de una larga trayectoria personal, que es lo más importante, y también académica. El profesor Eric Van Jong es de sobra conocido, tanto a niveles de la historiografía norteamericana como mexicana, mexicanista, y a niveles evidentemente internacionales y de América Latina. Se licenció en la Universidad de Chicago en 1967, obtuvo su maestría en la Universidad de California en Berkeley en 1968 y en esta misma universidad su doctorado en 1978. Fue profesor asistente en la Universidad de Minnesota en 1979-1980, en la Universidad de Texas, Austin, que me imagino que es una universidad que va a estar ampliamente referenciada, y aquí tenemos uno de sus representantes magníficos en este congreso, entre 1980 y 1982, y desde 1982 ha sido en sus diversos estadios profesor de la Universidad de California, San Diego, hasta su jubilación en 2009. Ha publicado más de 150 artículos, capítulos de libros, una veintena de libros, ha asistido a más de 150 conferencias, ha dado y ha impartido conferencias en Estados Unidos, en México, en Ecuador, en Colombia, en Israel, en España, en Francia, en Inglaterra, en Escocia, en Países Bajos, Australia, Argentina, entre otros países. Y es autor de títulos de referencia y de una amplia referencia. Solo voy a citar algunos de ellos. La crisis del orden colonial, estructura agraria y rebeliones populares de la Nueva España, 1750-1821, en 1992. La colección documental de la independencia mexicana, editada en 1998. Un título de amplísima referencia, ineludible referencia, también creo que va a salir en este congreso. La otra rebelión, la lucha por la independencia de México, 1810-1821, editado en Stanford en 2001 y editado por Fondo de Cultura Económica en 2010. Economía política y cultura en la historia de México, ensayos historiográficos en 2010. Y su biografía, que ha estado trabajando en los ya bastantes últimos años, de Lucas Alamán y México, 1792-1853, en Yale University Press 2021, y que está traduciéndose en estos momentos y que será editado por Fondo de Cultura Económica. Muchísimas gracias, profesor Van Jong. Muchísimas gracias, Eric, por estar aquí. Y evidentemente no te podemos dar un abrazo personal, te lo mandamos virtual.
Antes que nada quisiera agradecerte todos esos comentarios de introducción tan generosas y saludar a los colegas allá del Congreso, que seguramente va a ser un evento magnífico. Ojalá que pudiera asistir personalmente, pero en estos días no estoy viajando mucho, pero agradezco a los organizadores la invitación tan interesante para participar. En segundo lugar, les pido una disculpa porque debido a un mal entendimiento por mi parte, solamente en los últimos días preparé mis comentarios y como me cuesta trabajo escribir en español y como no me alcanzó tiempo para tenerlos traducidos por otra persona, los voy a leer en inglés, que me imagino que habrá poca dificultad para ustedes, mis oyentes, entenderlo, pero en el caso de que tengan dificultades, he mandado el texto a los organizadores junto con dos ensayos obituarios, uno sobre Jaime Rodríguez y otro sobre Kristen Archer. Entonces, sin más prólogo por el momento, voy a empezar con mis comentarios que son some personal reminiscences of Jaime Rodríguez, Linda Alexander Rodriguez, and Kristen Archer. Many years ago, Kristen Archer remarked to me in his inimitably expansive style that at some point in the past, he had found himself passed out on Pugin's porch, presumably from an excess of some sort of cocktail. This phrase has stuck with me for many years because one remembers things said by people one values. The way he recited the anecdote was funny, and the phrase itself is alliterative and therefore easily recalled. In preparing these remarks, I looked up Pugin's porch to find that it is a well-known restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina, where Chris, possibly accompanied by his wife Carol, may once have attended an academic conference or some other event. The restaurant specializes in the cuisine of the southern United States, which means that nearly everything on the menu is deep fat fried and or covered in a heavy creamy sauce, a style of cooking guaranteed eventually to produce a heart attack in anyone who eats there too often. This is rather like the Peking duck I once dined on near Tiananmen Square in Beijing. While absolutely and breathtakingly delicious, this dish is only to be eaten about once every 20 years. Pugin, by the way, was the name of a friendly neighborhood dog who had wandered the area for several years, a favorite haunt of his, the front porch of the house that would later become the restaurant. The distinguished ponentes at this conference, whose academic theme is Transformaciones y Revoluciones Políticas y Militares en Hispanoamérica, 1808 hasta 1835, but whose intellectual and emotional center is to render an homenaje to the late Kristen I. Archer, Jaime E. Rodriguez O., and Linda Alexander Rodriguez. Those distinguished ponentes will surely offer some enlightening analyses of the scholarly work of these three historians. The role I have assumed here, however, is to offer a few brief remarks of personal reminiscence and appreciation of these fine scholars whom I counted as friends for about 40 years. Although I saw a good deal of Linda on several occasions, I knew her less well, and so will focus my remarks principally on Archer and Jaime Rodriguez. I append separately, as I've said, an obituary essay on Chris Archer, authored by his colleague Hendrik Cray, a historian of Brazil at the University of Calgary in Canada, where Chris long made his career, which will be published in the American journal, The Americas, and another obituary on Jaime Rodriguez written by me and Jaime's longtime colleague in the Department of History at the University of California, Irvine, Stephen Topic, and that will appear in the Hispanic American Historical Review. An obituary on Linda Rodriguez is, I believe, being commissioned by the Hispanic American Historical Review. All three of these people were valued friends and colleagues of mine, but even closer friends among themselves, coincidentally dying within 6 months or so of each other. Chris in December 2021 at age 81, Linda in early 2022, as far as I can determine, at age 79, and Jaime in June 2022 at 82 years old. By most contemporary standards, these were long lives, so the sadness and loss we feel at their death should not be darkened even further by thoughts that they were cut down in their youth with unfulfilled promise ahead of them, although all of them were productive scholars and might have graced us with more works in their last years. Closely associated with them, in my experience, were many Mexican scholars, among them Virginia Gadea, Spaniards, including Manuel Chust and Ivana Frasquet, and in the U.S., Colin McLaughlin, with whom Rodriguez collaborated on a book, and also my very dear friend, the late Paul Vanderwood. I understand that Chris and the two Rodriguezes traveled together, shared professional experiences, as, for example, a stay at the prestigious Rockefeller Bellagio Center in Italy, and encouraged, discussed, and criticized each other's scholarly works. Kristen Archer and his wife Carol had children, all of whom survived them. Linda and Jaime did not. As I have said, I cannot claim to have known Linda as well as I did Chris and Jaime, mostly because we three men shared a scholarly interest in Mexican history, while Linda's substantial contributions to the historiography of Jaime's native Ecuador lay far outside my area of research and writing. But Linda was a formidable woman who occupied an important administrative post at UCLA and taught history there for many years. I remember that she was a welcome presence at all our encounters, had a dauntingly quick mind and sharp memory, liked to laugh, was fond of liquor, and as a personality, projected a very engaging version of the Texas Belle. Despite all these lovely qualities, I remember Linda as seeming a bit fragile and perhaps wounded in some way. Jaime's and Chris's interests were fairly different, even if their work overlapped productively at many points, and their personal and collaborative friendship was close. Speaking for myself, after many years of writing about Mexican history and teaching about Latin America, I realized only recently that my own work has principally been about power, the many forms it takes, how it is represented, how it is acquired, how it is used and abused, how it is resisted, and how it is lost. Without stretching the definition of power out of all recognition, I think that this theme is common to many, if not most, historians, either explicitly or implicitly. This was true of Jaime and Chris as well. Although Jaime made excursions into economic history and works of historical synthesis, his dominant interest was always politics in a fairly traditional sense, specifically state and nation building in Mexico and in Spanish America more broadly. His research embraced the late colonial era and the first half or so of the 19th century. This is abundantly clear in his magnum opus, the 2012 book, We Are Now the True Spaniards, Sovereignty, Revolution, Independence, and the Emergence of the Federal Republic of Mexico, 1808 to 1824, based upon a lifetime of thinking, research, and writing about the period. I confess, although I think Jaime must easily have guessed this, that I was one of the anonymous, entre comillas, anonymous readers of the book manuscript for Stanford University Press and recommended its publication enthusiastically. I provided one of the two blurbs on the back dust cover, and I quote, "This book will truly constitute a landmark study in the historiography of Mexico. Its revisionist position will change our view of Spain and the process of independence in its transatlantic realms, a judgment I would not back away from a decade later." One of the most interesting sections of this substantial book is Chapter 3, in which Jaime offers a careful analysis of the 1809 elections in New Spain for deputies to the Cortes de Cádiz of the following year, often ignored by historians of the period. That is, the elections, not the Cortes, certainly. And though I think Jaime would proudly have worn the label of Atlanticist, as some of the ponentes in this conference point out, he was extremely punctilious, that is, careful about the nuts and bolts of politics down to the local level. He once remarked to me that his interest in Mexican independence, which informs a good part of this book and of his work more generally, was really meant as an enormous brush clearing for discussion of the political forces at play in the early republic, especially federalism and the Constitution of 1824. Kristen Archer, on the other hand, with a few notable exceptions, was always more interested in the power politics, strategies, tactics, and even the social implications of warfare. This thematic interest is clear in the work for which he is perhaps best known, his Bolton Prize-winning book of 1977, The Army in Bourbon, Mexico, 1760 hasta 1821, as well as much of his later work. In these pages, he explored what the composition of the late Bourbon Army in New Spain reflected of the society in which it was embedded. The articles he produced on the Mexican insurgency of 1810 to 1821, which could easily add up themselves to a long book, embraced politics, but primarily military questions, ranging from the actions of individual figures to strategic issues. I had the impression from casual remarks of his that in fact he intended to write such a unified history of Mexican independence, of the Mexican independence struggle, but never got around to it. Although some of his friends here might want to correct me in this. One might make the same observation that power was his central theme in the considerable corpus of his work on Spanish exploration in the Northern Pacific, in which the struggle for power was mastery of the unknown and the environment. I was half a scholarly generation behind Jaime and Chris, but they both shared their work and their critical thinking generously with me in many lively private conversations and conference settings. It is dangerous to speculate on how a historian's background forms her or his scholarly interests, but it is not too much of a stretch to suggest that Jaime's own father's involvement in Ecuadorian military and political affairs influenced the course of his research and writing, especially in his early work. In Chris's case, as one obituary writer has noted, his interest in military history may have stemmed in part from his family members' stories of service in the British and Canadian armed forces during the 20th century's two world wars. Kristen Archer and Jaime Rodriguez could not have been more different as personalities. In debate, Jaime could be very insistent in his quiet way, marshaling arguments and facts precisely and deploying an enormous knowledge of his field. I never knew him not to be wearing a suit and tie, maybe because I seldom saw him in less formal circumstances. With his neatly trimmed graying beard, he had the look and presentation of a Spanish caballero. His characteristic habitual throat clearing somehow conveyed the impression that he was about to say something important, which was often the case. Reserved as he was, he could lose his temper, and it seems to me he must have been a formidable infighter in institutional settings. Although I knew him well, my impression was of a rather reserved man, not inclined to share intimacies, at least not with me. I do recall, however, an evening we spent together at dinner, just the two of us, in an upmarket restaurant in Irvine near his university after the conclusion of one of the many interesting small conferences he organized over the years. We shared a certain amount of alcohol, and I have a vague recollection of his letting his guard down and talking about his past. I only wish I could recapture the moment, but I too was a bit sozzled on multiple martinis and so cannot summon up much of the conversation. Although not a large man, Jaime could claim a certain charisma and thus command a room, perhaps in my eyes because I always held him somewhat in awe. One situation in which his gifts of person and statesmanship served him superbly was in his foundation and helmsmanship, that is, his direction, of the journal Mexican Studies Estudios Mexicanos over several decades. I was on the University of California side of the editorial board for some years, so I saw Jaime operate at close range. Truly admirable was the cool but insistent manner in which he conducted editorial board meetings, negotiated with the UNAM co-sponsors and with the bureaucratically muscle-bound University of California system, how he dealt with recalcitrant authors and kept the journal running with the help of his extremely capable administrative assistant, Carla. Over the years, I saw less of Kristen Archer than I would have liked, since he lived in Canada and I in Southern California, while Rodriguez and I were regularly drawn together on journal business, and our universities were only 85 miles apart. Many of my encounters with Archer were in fact at conferences organized by Jaime Rodriguez at Irvine or at Chris's own university in Canada. Those who knew Chris would probably agree that his physical presence could light up a room with his smile, his laughter, his infectious good humor, his wit, his personal warmth, and the sense that he was enjoying every minute of any social interaction. It seemed to me that he could get along with anyone and showed an interest in everyone, much like his and my old friend Paul Vanderwood. He could be serious, but I think tended to reserve this for intellectual discussion, writing, and scholarly controversy. In person, he was the most engaging of people, always ready with a quip or a wry observation, and loved hearing good jokes or even a bad one. He was extremely generous and hospitable. I was at the University of Calgary several times at his invitation, perhaps twice to give lectures and maybe twice for small workshop-style conferences. His hospitality to me and to other invitees on these occasions was well known. In my own case, once at the lovely home he had made with his wife Carol, where I stayed for a couple of nights. Whether on Pugin's porch in his home or at a conference dinner, Chris enjoyed drinking, which boosted his already notable personal warmth, humor, and hearty laughter by several degrees and decibels. I remember one notable dinner during a conference when Chris took the attendees out for a wonderful steak dinner. And I should note that the province of Calgary, where he lived, is known for the production of fine beef. He took the attendees out for a wonderful steak dinner at a well-known Calgary restaurant whose decoration, rather loudly patterned wallpaper, velvet drapes, and deep plush chairs of a vibrant wood. The decor suggested a bordello. Not that I ever been to one myself. My reference point was movies and books. Chris's generosity, at least in my experience, extended well beyond hospitality. In 2003, my book on Mexican independence, The Other Rebellion, already mentioned, published by the Fondo as La Otra Rebelión. In 2003, the book was awarded the Bolton Johnson Prize from the Conference on Latin American History for the best book in English and on Latin American history published in 2001. Without false modesty, I have long suspected that Archer's position as the chair of the selection committee for the prize may have had something to do with this, at least for what I assumed was his strong advocacy in behalf of my work. I also recall one golden Southern California afternoon around 1990 when Chris, Jaime, and I were scouting possible locations for the fall meeting of the Mexican, Canadian, and American historians of Mexico, of which Paul Vanderwood and I were the local organizers. The laughter and camaraderie among the three of us as we looked at one hotel or conference center after another still stands out in my mind after 3 decades. If one is lucky in one's professional life, one encounters people with the personal and intellectual qualities of Jaime Rodriguez, Linda Rodriguez, and Kristen Archer. Jaime was much quieter and reserved, Kristen much more voluble and open as a personality. Both of them were men of intelligence and integrity, as was Linda Rodriguez in her own right, and all of them accomplished scholars. It was a gift to have known them all for something like 40 years, but to have known such people 40 years were not enough. Eso concluye mis observaciones. Les mando mil gracias por haberme prestado su atención y porque tengo una cita casi inmediatamente me despido de ustedes mandándole esperanzas que tengan muy buena suerte con este evento tan bonito y espero que todo les vaya bien. Chao y gracias a todos.
Muchísimas gracias, Eric. Un fuerte abrazo.
Igualmente, Emmanuel.
Vamos a interrumpir 5 minutos o 15. Perfecto. Volvemos a las 11 y tenemos tiempo para un café. Antes de las 12, no.